Okay. Okay. Good evening. This is Winslow Sargent. So happy to have the opportunity to present to you on Facebook Live. I want to thank Jen Egypt for the opportunity to share my thoughts on MSMEs and supply chains in the age of after Corona. I know it sounds like a mouthful, but I hope to really get into detail in terms of what does MSMEs mean and supply chain and what does this after Corona, why are things different now in this age of after Corona? Just to give some background about myself, I am the president-elect of the International Council for Small Business, ICSB. ICSB was formed in 1955, and it has more than more than 4,000 members worldwide in 85 different countries, and it's a leading organization to represent the interests of MSMEs. I'm also the senior advisor for globalization and head of capital markets for Junices. It's a M&A firm that supports small and medium enterprises, helping them to grow in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. I've served on various boards. I've started many companies. I'm actually trained as an engineer. My background is in electrical engineering, where I practiced for many years. I started a number of companies, some very successful, and I've always had a passion for small business. It's something that I really wanted to know, how do you build a company? How do you start from scratch with an idea and to make a product or make something that's sustainable? And that's been my passion for a very, very long time. And so I'm glad that I can share it with you. Most notably, I from 2010 to 2015, I was the chief counsel for the Office of Advocacy at the U.S. Small Business Administration. I served in the Obama administration, and my goal and my focus at that point in terms of my duties was the chief counsel for advocacy, was the advocate for all 30 million small businesses within the U.S. And so I was the advocate before the White House, before the courts, before Congress, before state and local governments. My team and I, we worked to make sure that the voice of small business was heard, and that we would be on the lookout for anything that might be an impediment, but also share what are some of the opportunities. And so that's what I did for 2010 to 2015. But like I said, I'm so glad to be here tonight, and I know this is streamed all over the globe. And so whether it's daylight or during the day or in the middle of the night, I just want to thank you for taking time to come and watch me and hear some of my thoughts. And I hope that at the end of the session that this will be worthwhile. Please share your ideas with me. I'm trying to see how I can monitor what are some of the discussion that's going on, but this is a great way to use the tools that we have, and I know that although we're physically distant from each other, we are socially connected. I don't use the word socially distancing, because I believe it's more physically distanced from each other or spatially distant, but we're socially connected. And with technology, with this type of technology in the right hands. I have heard of where those have been using this for bad, whether photo bomb or Zoom bomb or whatever. But those in the right hands, like the team from Gen Egypt, Basma Hassan has been great, and she's worked with me to make sure that I'm up and running. This has been really a good tool. But this can't happen without a team of people who are supporting small businesses. And I just want to acknowledge the president of ICSB, Engineer Ahmed Osman. I want to thank him for his leadership and his friendship. He continues to be a leader in the small business community, and I benefited from his commitment and his approach to bringing in women and youth and those who have been left out, just to make sure that their voice is at the table, so that when we craft policies or when we advocate for policies, that truly the voice of small business is heard. So I just want to thank him for that. I also want to recognize the executive director of ICSB, Dr. Ayman El Tarabishi. He's also a professor with George Washington University. Dr. Tarabishi is truly a pioneer, and he's always looking for ways and to make the awareness of MSMEs. Most recently, he has been a champion for what's called the ICSB Exchange. During the week, many times he's hosted thought leaders on what can be done and how we can make the voice of small business heard. Although we're physically distant from each other, we're still socially connected. And this is a great opportunity for us to share our thoughts and to really get the word out in terms of you can do something. Just because we're apart, just because we're going through these tough times, doesn't mean that there aren't ways that we could still be proactive in starting a business and ways to innovate as well. Also want to give a thanks to ICSB Director and Managing Director of Tatur Misr, Dr. Ahmed Chalabi. He has combined his entrepreneurship within the real estate area with his love for education, and I know he's working hard with his educational city in the new administrative capital. I was able to take a tour and see where this new city will be built, and I'm very pleased to see that his vision is coming into being, and this is going to really be empowering for those who want to tap into education and tap into how to build a small business. And it's really relevant because, and I'll touch on this later in terms of why this is so important, because we're seeing more disruption nowadays around the world, and this is due to COVID-19. And so this disruption is causing us to not to be able to move around as freely as we once did. Now we have to look within ourselves and build and bring out some of the talents that we have. And for those who have foresight, I think this is a great opportunity to build on your MSME and to really make an impact. And so I touched on three things, especially within the title, right? I mentioned MSMEs. I mentioned the supply chain, and I haven't touched on that yet, but I am going to get to that. And I touched on after Corona, and I'm quite sure many of you want to know, how do you put this together? It's just like a recipe. How does an MSME and supply chain and after Corona, how do they go together? Well, I'm glad that you asked. Well, we are living in the age of after Corona. And what I mean by that, on March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization, WHO, declared that the coronavirus was a pandemic. March 11th, 2020. That was when WHO which is an arm of the United Nations, they declared that the coronavirus wasn't just a regular flu virus. It was, in fact, a pandemic. And because it was declared a pandemic, there were certain dominoes that had to fall into place. And so on March 13th, 2020, the United States enacted what's called the National Emergency Act in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Now we call it COVID-19. And that had a number of effects, right? So what that did is that really, sealed off the borders. I mean, it mandated that businesses, who, to a large extent, had to shut down. And so, because it was to stop the flow or the movement of people, to stop the spread of this coronavirus. Well, what is interesting, so that's where, so the word after corona, or the term AC, I picked up on because there was an article by a New York Times opinion columnist, Mr. Thomas Friedman. He wrote on March 17th, 2020, an article that was titled, "Our New Historical Divide, BC and AC, the World Before Corona and the World After." The title, "A New Historical Divide, BC and AC, the World Before Corona and the World After." What is interesting is that we're in the year 2020. And why I find that very interesting, because for many years we had these plans of what's going to happen in 2020. How will the world be different? Are we in the fourth industrial revolution? Will we have flying cars? Will we have, we have all these projections of where things would be. But in 2020, 2020 is now, I believe, forever will be defined as the time, the coming together of AC, of BC, no longer BC in the sense of BC and AD. Now we're BC and AC. BC before Corona, AC after Corona, in the year 2020. Like I said, in the year 2020, it's very interesting because when we think of 2020, that if I went to my ophthalmologist or went to an eye doctor, we use the benchmark of 2020 vision to be perfect vision. I can see some of you understand where I'm going. 2020 vision is viewed as you have very or perfect vision, which means that you do not need to have eyeglasses. Well, in the year 2020, we're seeing more clarity in terms of where we're going to be. Hindsight is BC, foresight is AC, but now we're in 2020. So we're going to see clarity in this year, beginning this year, that we've never seen before. This is a historic time in our lives in terms of how we're going to move forward. My colleague, Dr. Ayman El-Tarabishi, at the end of 2019, when he put together his top 10 things that MSMEs had to be concerned with or should look out for, the number one was called the end of the status quo. Little did he know, I believe, that what this end of the status quo meant. It meant that things were going to change, that we were no longer going to go along, or things were not going to just be run of the mill. No, that there was going to be severe disruption, and it's going to be a disruption such that we're going to have to revisit and relook at and take a look at all the things that we assumed, we planned, and what we would do. And so that's what I mean, that in AC and after Corona, we're all connected technologically, but now we're distant. And so what happens in AC, what happens in one part of the globe affects the other parts of the world. So we are very, very well connected. And in his article, he wrote that things can grow exponentially. That if you have something, or if there's something going on one side of the globe, we can no longer take the approach of it won't bother me. I'm that's someone else's problem. No, we're all connected. And if we don't recognize that, and after Corona, I think that we're going to, it is to our peril. As a matter of fact, that's what globalization was all about, was the fact that we were all connected and that we could all share in our resources. That was part of the supply chain. So, but here is the situation now. In COVID-19, there are more than 2 million cases worldwide, and the rate of infections are increasing around the world rapidly. There's a real concern that if out of that 2 million, that if the hospitalization rate is greater than 15%, that could overwhelm many of our healthcare systems. I mean, we don't have enough beds, we don't have enough monitors, technology, reagents, a whole bunch of things. We just don't have enough to care for people who need treatment. And on top of that, because of COVID-19, because of this pandemic, we're seeing closed borders, which restricts travel and is supposed to stop the spread of COVID-19. But as a result of the restriction of travel and the closing of borders, this has affected the supply chains. And that's what my message to you and for us to discuss. How will supply chains change? How will supply chains change in the age of after Corona? What is interesting that I find is that for those who are well connected and those who had resources and those who were famous and wealth, when they had a need for something, they could just get in their private plane or transportation somehow, or use their connection, and they could go across borders. Borders weren't an impediment. And so they may not have been invested in the local area, because if they needed to go to get health care, they would fly to where, quote unquote, the best health care was. Well, for the local people in those areas, they didn't have that benefit. But now, in after Corona, now we're more even. Now things are more equal. So even the well-connected, even the powerful, they have to stay within the confines of a border. And what that means is that they're going to have to make use of some of the services that sometimes they didn't tap into. And that's where MSMEs will play a bigger role, because MSMEs can provide those services. And so we started out by saying that supply chains were going to change, and because the interdependence would be broken because of closed borders, and that in after Corona. Well, before Corona, we, for many years, we talked about what is globalization and what does it mean to the world, right? Globalization is a word we use to describe the growing interdependence of the world's economies, cultures, and population, brought about by cross-border trade in goods and services, technology, flow of investment, people, and information. These are great qualities that globalization would bring, and of course, you want those things, that you want to make sure that if there any type of dislocation in one part of the globe, that those needs could be met if there was a surplus. And so the influx of information between countries would be reduced, you would reduce by tariff, by these barriers would be reduced, trade tariffs would be reduced, value-added taxes would be reduced, and subsidies. So it would be more of a common footing. It was supposed to promote economic growth, create jobs, and lower prices for consumers. Some of these things took place, but we also have the law of unintended consequences. The undesirable effect of globalization included large companies didn't have to pay taxes anymore, that they would extract, they would sell goods to places but didn't actually have to pay, have to give a return to those places. They would get concessions from workers. And so as a result, you had the richer countries. They became richer, and some of the poorer countries stayed the same, or they became poorer. So it wasn't as we would like to say, a rising tide lifted all boats. That wasn't the case at all. And so, but also what we saw, and this relates to the supply chain aspect of my talk, we saw the centralization of manufacturing, which resulted for many countries, the loss of know-how for the next generation. When you have manufacturing of products and goods going to one place, and if we say this place is going to now be the world's manufacturer of goods and services, what it does, it creates a lot of dislocations. It puts a lot of MSMEs out of work. But more than that, for the next crisis that comes about, it creates a void in terms of know-how. Because when you manufacture something, this is not a theoretical thing. When you manufacture, it's an empirical thing where you're actually building. And so there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of know-how that's gathered when you have to put products together, when you have to build. And that's why manufacturing to each country and each economy, each region is so important. And that's why we have to empower MSMEs in the manufacturing sector, in the sector that's actually producing goods. Because if we don't, and now with closed borders, then we have bottlenecks, then we have some shortages, right? And so I touched on the fact that, of course, that globalization allows smaller firms to make alliances. Yes, there were alliances between, there were small to small, across borders. We do have some data to show that. Of course, the prices were low, and also there was some investment capital. So there was there was a time where you saw capital flowing across borders to these SMEs, to these new markets. But also we saw threats. We saw that MSMEs, many of them went out of business because they couldn't compete at these lower prices. There was a brain drain, and so those who would normally work within an MSME, now they may go across border. And so we had out migration of some of the best and some of the most talented. And so that became a problem. So that left a void. But also we saw, once again, the reduction of manufacturing and the dependence abroad on those who would make crucial products. And so this is what COVID-19 has exposed, the shortcomings of globalization. This is when we talk about MSMEs and supply chains. For some countries, there are shortages of medicines and ventilators and drugs. Hoarding has taken place. And so that has exposed the fact that, this trading of going back and forth, in times of crisis, in times of this pandemic, you see bottlenecks. So those countries who need drugs, who need medicines, who need various things, have severe shortages because they're not making those within the country or within the region. And because of that, that's creating a problem. Because of COVID-19, because of the shutdown and lockdown that we're seeing worldwide, this is not just from a regional point of view, this is worldwide. we're seeing a recession, that's a worldwide recession, which could, in some places, it's more than a recession. It's a depression. I believe, this is the biggest um, crisis that we'll have in the last since the Great Depression that the U.S. had back in the late 20s and early 30s. This is a huge hole. So we're actually seeing the Corona generation will speak about these times in terms of when we had a shutdown in place, and what did this mean for them in terms of how technology was a bridge and how we still could communicate, but yet we still had to deal with some of these problems. And so with closed borders, like I said, we're having to look within our borders in terms of how do we survive, how do we make ends meet, how do we grow the economy, how do we stay healthy, how do we make an impact. And so that's the age that we're going to be in, and we're not going back. I don't think that we're going to go back to a time where, I mean, yes, there will be travel, and yes, there'll be cross-border um, commerce, because that's something that we need. I think that makes sense. But in terms of outsourcing everything and just to be a consumer society, I think those things are going to change. You're going to see more and more countries bringing back some of the critical. They're going to assess what are some of the critical needs, some of the critical products, what are the critical medicines, what are the critical technologies, what are the critical foods that they need. And they're going to create regional blocks, or within the country themselves, they're going to create areas where they're going to empower MSMEs to and to support MSMEs, to support an entrepreneur, to build a business, to stay in business, because they know that that is of national importance. Okay, and so when we talk about MSMEs, I remember many years ago when ITSB held our World Congress in New York, and we had a day at the United Nations, and I was a moderator for an ambassador panel, and we had 7 ambassadors, which included an ambassador from Egypt, Dr. Sahar Nasser, and we had an ambassador from Argentina, from Korea, from Australia, from Kuwait, from Indonesia, and what was interesting, we talked about the fact that MSMEs were not included at first for the SDGs. And so many of you know that the SDGs are 17 goals that were ratified in September of 2015. And the goal was by 2030, we would have, out of the 17, the 17 included no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industrial innovation and infrastructure, reduce inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life beyond water, below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions and partnerships for the goals. Now, these are 17 goals that are outlined. And so the International Council for Small Business at the time, led by Dr. Ayman El-Tarabishi, made the case that if you're going to accomplish these goals, you needed to include entrepreneurs and small business owners. Because if you didn't, then there's no way that you're going to reach these goals by 2030. And so what happened is that we appealed to the UN, and with leadership from Dr. Ayman El-Tarabishi, along with the government of Argentina, we were able to get a name day, a day the day is June 27th. What is interesting about June 27th, and it relates to AC and BC, June 27th is the day that we chose for MSME Day. But the reason why that day was chosen, because when we looked at the calendar, Dr. Terabishi noticed that day hadn't been chosen by anyone. But also, he, being a student of history, he recognized that the United Nations was formed on June 26, 1945, in San Francisco. Why was that important? Because June 26, 1945, when wars end, when the leaders come together and say, well, we need to form a body that will work to stop these kind of wars, to stop this type of conflict, it was June 27th. It was reasoned that the day after wars end, that's when the small business owner, that's when he or she goes out and sweeps in front of their grocery store. That's when the taxi cab driver gets in and makes a business. That's when the farmer says, I'm going to go out and plow the field. That's when the technologist says, I'm going to connect everyone because I'm going to supply goods and services. So on June 27th was the day after conflicts end. So June 27th, that's MSME Day. I think that one can make a good analogy that we're in the day after. The day after. What happens when the day after COVID-19? What happens when we're in the day after, when COVID-19 is no longer a threat? When we end some of these lockdowns, when we start to grow and we want to get back to some type of normalcy. Well, we're going to rely on entrepreneurs like yourself, on small business owners, on the youth, on women who have foresight, who have longevity on their side, who believe in building up of society. And so that's why I mean that when we live in the age of after Corona, we're going to see the reemergence or the prominence or the place where MSMEs will take a prominent role because it's so important, right? And so we know what has taken place in the U.S. For example, this has been a result of the lockdown, and so after the national emergency was declared, there was basically a lockdown or a shelter in place where many businesses closed. And so as a result, there's been a drop, there's been a decrease in terms of new business filings by 27%. 27% decrease of new business formation. That's almost a third drop of what we would expect to new businesses, new MSMEs to be formed. And that 27% is the largest decline in the history of data that we've taken. I mean, we have never seen a time like this in terms of this type of drop. We also have seen within the US, we've seen more than 24 million people for the first time sign up for unemployment insurance. 24 million. If I was to compare that with a time that we saw the highest number, the time that we saw the highest number before this time was 4 million people. So just think about that, 24 million people. And the last time we had such difficult times, it was 4 million people. So we're seeing a factor of 6 times, more than 6 times. And so these times are different. So when we talk about going back to normalcy, we're in the age of AC. We're in the age of after Corona. And so how have governments responded to after Corona, especially helping MSMEs? Well, the U.S. government, they gave guarantee, according to the IMF, they gave guarantees of more than 670 million US dollars, 670 billion with a B US dollars to small business. These are loan guarantees. These are to for small businesses to weather the storm, because when you're not able to open your shop, you're not able to you're not able to conduct trade. And of course, these businesses, they have they still have bills to pay. They need funding. They need capital just to survive. So 670 billion US dollars have been allocated. But it's viewed like it's still not enough. That if this drags on and if we're in shelter in place for much longer, then we're going to have to rethink, or we're going to have to take a look at how do these businesses survive. Many of these businesses will close because it's hard to maintain a business when you're not open. And so these are some of the concerns. But what has been a bright spot, some of these businesses have actually changed their business model. As I said earlier, there's been a shortage of certain things within the marketplace because of globalization. So what some of these businesses have done, they have innovated, right? So those who were seamstress, those who made drapes, now they're making face masks, and those who can make certain type of equipment for hospitals because they're in a short supply. They have retooled their businesses to address those challenges that were in the marketplace. And that's what MSMEs do in terms of a supply disruption. And that's how within the age of and after Corona, we're seeing that businesses are starting to adapt. They're starting to see where some of the opportunities are. In Egypt, for example, according to the IMF, the Egyptian government provided a stimulus package of 6.13 billion US dollars, or the equivalent of 100 billion Egyptian pounds, 100 billion Egyptian pounds, which is 18% of GDP for SMEs. And so this was to focus on monthly grants to regular workers and support for the healthcare sector, and with tax relief for many other sectors. The government had been proactive in giving some of the preferential loans for SMEs, for those in tourism, for those for housing, and for middle class families. And so they have reduced the interest rate by more than 300 basis points. And so these are some of the concerns. And some of you may ask, why this focus on SMEs or MSMEs? Well, if we look around the globe, in Japan, for example, 70% of workers work for SMEs or MSMEs. In Korea, that's 88%. In Sri Lanka, it's 35%. In Vietnam, it's 77%. In Indonesia, it's 98%. In Germany, it is 79%. And so, just as a sample, MSMEs have always been the backbone of an economy. I mean, because they're widespread, they're not localized to anyone. It's not, they're not just in the cities, but they're in the favelas. They're in the rural areas. They're in the towns. You have a merchant in any place you go, in any place, in any community you go. There are merchants. There's commerce being done. There's trade, and those are vital. Those are the fabric of society, and that's why it's important that we support them. But what I'm saying, my thesis is in that in AC, their prominence will grow even more. We're going to see a retrenchment from globalization, and we're going to see a need for those SMEs to really play a bigger role, because once again, in times of crisis, we need those businesses. Now, within the U.S., just to give some stat, there are about 30 million what we call SMEs in America, small businesses. Out of that 30 million, what is interesting, what most people don't know, there are 30 million small businesses in the U.S., right? But out of that, roughly about 25 million of those are non-employers. They don't have employees. So 81% of businesses are a single person. they just have a single person. And so 81% is the other 19% that hires 50% of the workforce. So just think that when you think about 25 million businesses with only one employee or the self-employed, just think that if they were to add one more person, you create 25 million jobs. As I mentioned to you that most recently there are 24 million people filed for unemployment. And so we see the power of exponential, in the age of after Corona, we see the power that if we harness these SMEs, then there's a tremendous benefit. In the U.S., by the way, in terms of large businesses, and we define U.S. large business as more than 500 employees, there are only 19,000 large businesses. But once again, they also employ half of the population. So this is what we're seeing. And so 99% of all firms are SMEs. They generate more than 1.3 trillion US dollars, and they're a force for good. And like I said, I think that their prominence will continue to increase. Now, just as a note, within those 30 million businesses, 30% of those businesses are headed by women-owned business. So we recognize that although women are half the population, only 30% of those businesses are headed by women. That's a start, but we can see that there's a lot of room to grow. And so that's something that in after Corona, we need to empower everyone, because what we know is that knowledge is not localized to any one gender or race or religion or region. We need to empower those who have the ability, who have the desire to contribute, and that's what we must do, and that's what we must see in after Corona. And I got this information from the Egyptian Ministry of Trade and Industry report. In Egypt, we tend to think of SMEs as up to 50 employees. And this is under the Small Business Enterprise Law 141. And so SMEs in Egypt represent 95% to 98% of total industry. So 75% of the workforce. 75% of the workforce in Egypt work for MSMEs. 75%. Now, this is the data that we know of, but one could argue that the number is actually larger than that, because a large part of businesses in Egypt are informal. That means that they're not registered. And so when we look at the fact that by the numbers we have, 75%, so one could extrapolate that could be north of 80, 85 or so percent of the businesses of those who work for MSMEs are actually working for small businesses, if you include those who are from the informal sector. And also, what we also see that 35% of MSMEs are family businesses where two or more members of the owners are related. And so and that's a phenomenon that we see, because MSMEs are not going to move across borders, and so they're a vibrant and important fabric within the society. And so that's why we have to support SMEs. But going back to supply chains, we're going to see that we are seeing the breakdown of globalization. We're seeing that what globalization did is that it created a high dependency of clients. For example, your subcontractors, and many of those subcontractors were abroad, but because of the closed borders, but because of not being able to travel, We're seeing some shortages. And because of that, in the age of after Corona, we're actually going to see those supply chains, those lengths are going to shrink. And so we're not going to see a centralization of products as we had in the past. We're actually going to see more regional and local. And so that's where I think that MSMEs will make a huge impact. Also, what we're seeing because of the shutdown, because of this lockdown or the shelter in place, we're seeing a rise in what we call the delivery economy, right? Because we're less mobile, we're seeing those who are entrepreneurial and who can deliver goods and services as part of the supply chain. The supply chain just means that we're moving goods from one place to the next. And so we're seeing the supply chain, a reinvention of the supply chains in our cities, in our villages, and in our towns, where you're going to each two person's home or residences or compounds, and that's the delivery economy. And so for those who are, and I don't think this is going to go away. We're not going to go back to yes, we are going to go back to restaurants and we are going to go back to be social, but we are still going to maintain access. Those who may not be able to be social, those who may not be able to travel, they're going to need a delivery of goods and services. And so that's where I think that when you think of the supply chain aspect, it's not just across borders anymore. It's going to be within each country, within each region. You're going to see the supply chains to each other's door. You'll see the farmer who have goods and services. Rather than throwing out those goods, or those goods are rotting in the marketplace, you're going to see warehouses. You're going to see those goods are going to be converted. I know that I always tell my colleagues that some of the best juices I've ever had come from Egypt. The guava juice, the mango juice, the strawberry juice. The orange juice. Some of the best juices. And so what we're going to see is that those juices may not be widespread throughout the country or widespread throughout the region. And so some entrepreneurs will take that and use their know-how, use the supply chain aspect for delivery. Those who are not able to get to the Alexandria region, or those who may be in Aswan or other parts, or in Sharm el-Sheikh, they're going to be able to get access more to fresh fruits, fresh vegetables. But it's not just fruit and it's going to be a whole host of services. And that's what I mean, that we're going to be in the age of Corona, that we're going to see a huge opportunity in terms of what's taking place. And this is really needed because as I was looking at some data, I saw that for Africa, for example, in Egypt, in all of Africa, when we think of COVID-19, there is a need for, and as the healthcare industry assess what is needed, there's a need for 15 million masks, 5.2 million gowns, 273,000 goggles, 13 million gloves, and 500,000 liters of disinfectants or reagents. There's a need. That means that need hasn't been met. Because once again, with globalization, there are certain countries who were deemed as the manufacturer on record. They manufactured goods and services, and they delivered kind of the just-in-time model. Well, that just-in-time model has now broken down. With closed borders, with limit in terms of transport, with countries thinking about their own good or their own benefit, they're not sharing or they're not delivering those goods and services as was expected. And so I think that when you look at Africa, for example, you think that this is a continent that is really the future of the world when you think of the youth. the youth, this Corona generation, the youngest continent is the African continent. When you think of Egypt, for example, when you think of all the young people, when you think of the MENA region, you will run businesses. You're going to be the thought leaders. You're going to actually take the baton that we have today and run with it. And so I can see how you're going to reshape the discussion in terms of globalization, in terms of commerce, in terms of opportunity. I think that these are some for you, I mean, and for the youth in general, these are some of the best times to be alive because for one, for for the first time, many of the incumbents who have been on top for a very, very long time, they're shaken because of COVID-19. Many of the businesses who've been in existence for a very long time, some are filing for administration or Chapter 11 or bankruptcy because things are shaken. And so what this does, it gives those of you who are entrepreneurial, who have foresight, who have vision, who have access to technology, who know where things are going, an opportunity to really make a big impact. And it's needed. You know, when I was looking through the numbers in terms of, just for example, for the healthcare sector for the African continent as a whole, and this is according to the UN, 69% of the disinfectants that are imported to the African continent. 69%. 69%. You mean there are a lot of natural resources and a lot of raw materials that can be made right on the continent that could fit this, that could fit the population, that could fit this need. But because we've outsourced, or these have been outsourced, these countries have to import 69% of disinfectants. Gloves, 87% of gloves, 87% of gloves for the healthcare sector are imported. 87%. Goggles, 83% of goggles are imported. Mask, so to stop the spread of infection, 58% of the masks are infected. There are those of you who know how to make masks. There are those of you who know how to make goggles. There are those of you who know how to make gloves. There are those of you who know how to make disinfectants. Gowns, likewise. Well, I know that the Egyptian cotton is very well known for very good quality. Masks can be made. Gowns could be made. I mean, there are a whole bunch of products that can be made just from the resources that are within your borders. And so that's why I mean that the supply chains will be disrupted and that MSMEs will take their prominent place. We're in after Corona, we're not going back, and it's very, very important. And just to touch on just a few more points, because I do appreciate the fact that you're spending time to hear what I have to say. I mentioned in terms of the African continent, when you look at the data in terms of the population, there's a population boom that's happening. In Cairo, for example, the population is expected to grow by 23% by in the next 20 years. From 2010 to 2025, the population in Cairo is expected to grow by 23%. So by 2025, the population in Dar es Salaam grew from 2010 to 2025, 85%. Nairobi, 77%. Addis Ababa, 62%. Alexandria, 28%. Algiers, 28%. Casablanca, 23%. Cape Town, 12%. So we're seeing a growth of the population. So the youth, so this is the time for the youth. So when I think of MSMEs, when I think of supply chain, I also think of the youth. I think of those who will lead the charge and to build these businesses that are not only going to affect the region, that are also going to make a major impact worldwide. And it's in light of the SDGs, the 17 goals. And they're going to be smarter in terms of how they build these businesses. They're going to think about zero zero hunger and no poverty and what's good for the environment. And so these are some of the things that I'm really excited about. I can go on and on, but I welcome your thoughts in terms of where you see things are going. We're in the age of AC. Please use 2020 as, please use your 2020 vision in 2020. Please be optimistic, because we're going to get through this. And I think that we're going to become stronger, and it's going to be your knowledge, your intellect, your action. There's no time to think about the good old days. Yes, those days were good. Some of them weren't so good, but I think the future is bright. And so I'm just encouraged that working with Gen Egypt and working with leaders within your country and working with ICSB and working with others within the region, we're going to build a system that's not going to just help you and your family, but it's going to help your community, it's going to help the country, it's going to help the region. And so I just want to thank you for the opportunity to share with you. Please visit icsb.org, and you can send me your thoughts and let's connect together. And once again, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to speak, and enjoy your night, enjoy your evening. I know the iftar dinner is coming up soon, and so have a good night. Thank you. Bye bye.